There we go. So welcome to our small group today. And do we have a volunteer for an opening prayer, or would you volunteer?
I'd like to volunteer.
Okay, that'd be great.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank thee that we may be gathered together over the internet, and we thank thee for everyone who could join in. We ask thee to please bless us with thy Holy Spirit and to send thy angels to be around us and be with and to help us. Please bless that we may learn thy gospel and that we may remember it and that we may learn to apply it in all aspects of our life. In the name of Yeshua Messiah, amen.
Amen.
Thank you. So I was thinking today to actually go over a few ideas. I get asked some questions sometimes about various things, and one of the things they get asked about is how to it's the same question as always: how do you talk to the Lord? And some people actually have gotten very angry when they ask me that, and when I especially when I answer that, and they get very, very angry. They take offense to the answer. So I thought I would cover a couple of things and see if it would help. Nobody here has gotten upset at me for it, but I have had people that have uh, really kind of taken offense. It's hurt them a lot. So um, I think sometimes it hurts because they just because it goes against their original like the doctrine that they grew up with, and so they have a very hard time. Other times I think it's because of the vanity and things like that. Why should some goofy guy who comes from Canada and lives on a farm and doesn't know anything, why should the Lord talk to him? That sort of thing. So I thought we could start with a question, and maybe we could get some ideas going. So the idea is I get asked, what can I do to get so close to the Lord that I can actually hear the Lord's voice? And so this is a good question. Does anybody have any ideas? Can anybody name off any ideas of things that we could do to get closer to the Lord?
Well, I can speak for myself. I think the main thing is have a desire to do that. I mean, they've asked the question as though they have the desire, but a lot of people really don't care. So I think
That is true. That is very true.
big issue is making that your quest.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, absolutely. So one of the things that a person could do is like the same as that they would teach you in school. When you want to accomplish something, they tell you to make a plan, and then break down that plan into smaller and smaller steps until they're achievable steps, things you can work on every day. And so you can actually achieve those steps, but you have to do the work in order to be able to accomplish that goal. And so, um, if you'd like, I'd say get out a pencil and paper and write down about at least 20 direct things that you can do that will get you to the Lord. And I'm not sure if 20 is quite enough, but at least 20. So the first, five or so are pretty easy because everybody really knows where they're lacking, and they can get up a little earlier, study the scriptures a little more, pray a little more, have a little bit more faith, follow a little more accurately, and follow in all four directions. The first five are pretty easy. The second five get a little harder because you're trying to come up with things that maybe you didn't think of before. But the last 10 get really difficult. because you're coming up with things and they can't just be pulled out of thin air. These have to be things that will directly affect your closeness to the Savior. Not just closeness in emotions, not just closeness in your mind, but actual physical proximity. So by the time you get to number 20, you've got some good ideas down. And I think that if a person would do these things every day, all 20 of them, every single day, all day long, every day, then it wouldn't take very long before you actually accomplished your goal of getting to the Savior. Now, this is just one thing, and it is that thing. I mean, a person who wants to get into shape, goes to the gym, starts running, enters an exercise program. But a person who's really dedicated to getting into shape now as fast as they can, they will look into all aspects. For example, they'll look into not only an exercise regime, they'll look into cross training, they'll look into their diet and their sleep schedule and the people they hang around and everything that they possibly can. But this doesn't mean that if they don't have something available, they don't try or they don't do it, because a great deal of athletes have come up out of poverty and out of very bad situations where they could not do an awful lot of things. They never had the privileges of those things, but they still came up out of it. And why? Well, they have that certain level of devotion. And this is the same for spiritual things. I do often come across people who are very angry that they have not reached the Lord, and somebody as lowly as me has. And they get very, very angry about it. They call you all kinds of names. They shove you around, hit you, hurt you, injure you physically, damage you, takes years to heal. All kinds of things, just for the plain fact that you have made it to the Lord and you are beneath them, at least in their eyes. And so that arrogance is what blocks them from ever getting to the Lord. Of course, that arrogance is kind of an interesting thing, because the arrogant always accuse others of being arrogant. And the lazy always accuse others of being lazy. Sometimes the lazy accuse the successful people of being arrogant, and sometimes the arrogant people accuse the failures at being lazy. But the bottom line is still the bottom line. We have this humility aspect that must be respected. If you cannot humble yourself, then you will not make it. You have to be completely humble. And a completely humble person, never complains, not even inside their mind, because this is what it means when the Lord says that he judges us on our hearts and he knows man, the inside of man. And this is what it actually means. In other words, you will get the blessings if you're not doing it inside. And if you are doing it inside, you will not get the blessings. So it's pretty simple to see if you're not getting the blessings of being able to talk to the Lord. You're messing up on the inside of yourself. And you have to be humble enough to accept that, and then to go forth and work with that. So that's a pretty big one there, and a pretty big step that we have to pay attention to. So if we are willing to do those 20 things, once you start doing them, it becomes easier and easier, because you get that momentum going. And once you get the momentum going, all you got to do is keep it going. Sometimes it's difficult to get it going, but once you get it going, you have to keep it going. Never let it stop, because when the momentum stops, it's difficult. But I will let you in on a hopeful result, and that is, once you start succeeding, once you get to the Lord, it's pretty easy to get to him again, as long as you don't stop, not even for a day. Don't stop. Always keep that momentum going. And as long as you keep that momentum going, it becomes easy. It becomes easy to get to the Lord. It doesn't mean it's easy as in there's no work. There's a lot of work and a lot of devotion and a lot of effort. But because you didn't stop, the momentum carries you through. But you have to keep it going. And that means that, like, if you're pushing a car, once you get it going, you want to keep it going, especially if you have to push it up a little bit of a hill. You don't want it to stop. You want it to stay going. And the concept is if it stops, it's going to be a lot harder to get it going. Doesn't mean it's hard. It's not hard. It is still hard to keep it going, but it's a whole lot easier to keep it going once it's in motion. And the only way to get it in motion is to put in the effort, the determination, the dedication to get it going. That's back to those 20 things again. And you have to keep each and every one of those things every single day, all day long, 24/7. And then it becomes almost impossible to fail. So the real reason that prophets succeed is not because they are chosen or because, somebody waved a magic wand or something silly. It's really because they work their butt off. They really work so hard at meeting the prerequisites to hear the Lord. And again, they never complain and say the Lord's not talking to me. They know the Lord is talking. They know they are the ones who are not listening. And that is why they work, and they work so hard to get in tune with that voice. I think I'd like to talk a little bit about that voice, though. This is the voice of the Lord is actually a physical, audible sounding voice. If the Lord speaks to me right now, anybody around can hear the Lord's voice. Some people cannot hear well enough, and all they hear is like mumbling or whispering. Some people cannot hear very well at all, and all they hear is like what sounds like somebody's stomach grumbled or something, or that the building shifted or something, and that's all they can understand. Some people, all they can hear is just like the sound waves that are bumping into the little hairs on your ears or something. But the Lord speaks, and it's a real, live, audible voice. It's not a voice in your head or something like that, or thoughts. You're not carrying on a conversation inside your head somewhere. It's an actual voice, actual person, and an actual person talking. And this is interesting. And we've seen many stories from history where people are outside the prophet's door and hearing voices inside, can't make out quite what's being said, but hearing voices and distinct different voices. And when, of course, questioning the prophet, they find out that an angel or the Lord or someone had come to visit and was talking to them. It's a real voice. The voice of the Lord is a real voice that people can hear. And the Lord is a real person. He has been resurrected. We're just going through the Easter season for the Christian world. The Lord has been resurrected. And he came back and showed himself to his apostles. He showed himself to those at the Festival of Weeks, like over 500 people at the same time. He showed himself to thousands at on the Nephite side of the world. The Lord is alive and well and is a person. You can see him, touch him, everything. Shake his hand. It's not that difficult to do. He's a real person. So it's very important that we realize this and understand this. The Lord is an actual person. Just like if I say, well, hey, I was talking to you this morning, and you told me this and you told me that. I had that conversation up in my head, but I knew it was you because it sounded like you. It sounded like something you would say. You know, you'd start thinking I was a nut. Of course, maybe you do already. That's okay. So sometimes you feel like a nut. Sometimes you don't. I'm old. Almond joys have nuts and mounds don't. There you go. I knew I could work that into the gospel somewhere. So it's very interesting stuff because, see, the Lord is actually real. And this is one thing you have to believe if you're going to actually talk to him. You do need to change your beliefs. So you do need to humble yourself. And you have to basically think that all your beliefs are garbage and you need new beliefs. And you have to be open to receiving new beliefs, brand new, even if the ones you held to you think are wonderful and good, get rid of them. You got to be open to new beliefs. Even if the ones you have are good beliefs, don't hold to them. Get to the right beliefs, get to the correct beliefs so that you can hear the Lord, talk to him, see him, everything, shake his hand. It's definitely something you need to consider. So the more that you hold on to good beliefs, because we've traveled around to different communities and did our preaching in different communities, and they would say things like, well, if you really did talk to the Lord, he would have told you that our church was true. And that's a big one I get. And then if you really talk to the Lord, he would have told you that you need to do your hair this way. He would have told you the proper dress code and you wouldn't come looking like that. If you really did come from the Lord, then you would have started with a word of prayer. If you really did come from the Lord, you would have done, and they list off all of their own beliefs. The problem is they don't have the result. Their beliefs are blocking them, or more appropriate to say would be not that their beliefs are blocking them as much as their insistence on those things are blocking them. They're not willing to allow for their beliefs to be incorrect. And so that amount of pride to hold so tightly is what's blocking them. And that arrogance, again, is what's blocking them, that vanity. So humility and meekness are the most important keys to seeing and talking to the Lord. And it's very important to understand this kind of thing. We're going to need somebody to go unlock the gate. Is there anybody here that maybe you could send? Tell them to go find somebody that'll go.
We got somebody going.
Oh, good. Never mind. You can come back. If you didn't leave already. There he is. All right. So maybe we should jump back on topic here. So let's see. One of the things that I found is that once you get correct doctrine in, you got to put in some work. And this is where, again, we often lose people because the concept of work is pretty hard. And they like to go back to their old belief of, being chosen and all of that kind of stuff. And that's something that you have to be very careful about. But it's not that you have to be chosen, it's that you have to meet the prerequisites. And so you got to put in some work. You got to put in the work. So, once you get the proper doctrine, once you figure out that the Lord is actually a real person, once you figure out that his only interest is teaching you how to actually become like him, once you figure out that he's willing to keep giving you lots of advice and any type of advice that you want in order for you to progress. Then you start figuring out that, why isn't he doing it for me? Why isn't he just waving his magic wand? And you have to drop that belief. There's no such thing as a magic wand. The Lord cannot do that, or he would stop being God. And he cannot actually wave his magic wand and have things work. He doesn't have a magic wand. So what this means is that we have to actually put in the work. And one of the work is, like, for example, a prophet. What do you think? Like those 20 things you wrote down, first thing you do in the morning is, number one, don't oversleep. Get up early. Get up early and start praying. Get up early and pray. I mean, you should be able to pray for an hour straight, no problem. There's no difficult in talking to a real person for an hour. If you woke up and your friend was visiting you and you woke up, you went into the kitchen, your friend was already up, you'd have no problem talking to him for an hour. Why should you have a problem talking to a real person for an hour? You shouldn't. There is no problem about it. So you should be able to pray and talk to the Lord for an hour, no problem. I'm sure many of us could talk 4 or 5 hours, no problem. But the only problem with that is then you would be neglecting your other duties. So after you pray for an hour, you need to get up and run and do your chores, right? You make sure you're praying the whole time you're doing your chores, but you get up and run and do your chores because you want to run. You want to get your chores done. You want to be able to get back and get to your scriptures, and you want to be able to study your scriptures and continue praying and hearing the voice of God audibly, of course. And you want to be asking him questions about the scriptures. You want to be cross-referencing things. You want to be figuring out how what the Lord taught is accurate. You got to study so hard that you can back up the Lord with scriptures. That if he was teaching and you were there while he was teaching people, you have to study the scriptures so hard that you can back up the Lord. Every reference, to which he's referring. You can actually tell people those references. You want to get your nose into the scriptures. And so you need to know them very well, and you need to know how they back up the Lord in his doctrine. So once you know him, you know his doctrine, you know what we just talked about. Once you get up early and you start praying, and you don't stop praying all day. You keep talking, and he keeps talking back, and you will hear his voice. And the more you can focus, because sometimes we lose our focus for a minute because we don't want to get our hand caught in a tractor or something like that, and we pay attention a little bit, and then we're not focusing enough on being able to hear because we're too worried about losing our hand. But if you pay attention, you can start learning to do both. So in fact, for myself, if I'm talking face to face with the Lord for too long, I get kind of nervous. I get jittery. And maybe this is not understandable to some people, but I get nervous because I'm not living the gospel. I'm just standing there talking with the Lord. And it's like you're sitting around gossiping all day. And you don't want to sit around gossiping with the Lord even all day. He's got work to do, and so do I. And so when you're talking to the Lord, you don't really want, like, once you get in the hang of the gospel, it really bothers you to be just sitting there talking to the Lord. It bothers you because you're not out helping people. You're not out trying to talk to people, trying to motivate them, trying to encourage them, trying to comfort them. You're not doing the gospel. Instead, you're talking to the Lord about it. And so it's definitely not good. It's definitely not good. It's like anything on the earth. If you're training to be a long distance runner or something, you're talking to the coach for hours and hours and hours a day, and you never get to running. It's not a fun life. It's a horrible life. You don't want to be talking for hours a day. You tell the coach, either run beside me or get in a car and drive beside me and let's talk while I'm running. The same thing with the Lord. The Lord will happily go along with you to live the gospel. You're not going to sit there and keep you there forever. I mean, you got to get up and do something. So I get kind of nervous if I'm talking to the Lord for too long, like face to face, because you got to get out and do stuff and you got to help people and you got to live the gospel. And so you do. And it doesn't matter whether you're washing dishes or whether you're sweeping the floor or whether you're working in the fields or whether you have a business profession or anything else. You got to get to work. And during that time that you're working, you need to be praying. And you need to be praying and paying attention enough that you can actually hear the actual voice of the Lord. Very, very important. So what are some of these things that you can do to get to the Lord? We said scripture study, we said praying. Those are just two things. What else can you do? How about being humble? How about being meek? How about being humble in every single thing, including in your mind and in your heart? How about being meek? Meek means you're going to actually follow the Lord's advice. There's no reasons and there's no observations and there's no anything as to why you're not following. You're following. That's all there is to it. You got to be meek enough to follow. So this is very important types of things to think about. Myself, I go through the sacred circle every day and I recognize how the sacred circle applies to everything in life and to every aspect of life, and especially in all four directions and in all four parts. And it's a very important part of serving the Lord. So always go through that every single day. And that's a great time to ask the Lord questions as well, because he loves answering questions about the sacred circle and how to apply it, especially how to apply it. It takes a great deal of devotion. So as I've said before, I don't understand how a person has enough time to be sad, to be miserable, to be lonely, to be, angry, to be depressed or anything else. How do you find the time to do all that? I mean, myself, I've got so much to do to get to the Lord. I don't have time for that. I can't focus my brain on those things and still find time to get to the Lord. And I dare say anybody who does focus on things, they don't have the time to get to the Lord. There's a lot to be done, and there's a lot of self-correction that needs to be done. And so you need to be able to correct yourself, especially on the inside. You have to be able to correct yourself.
Mothers would like Arabian House. Is that okay?
So have them send me a message. So that is very, very important. The baby just needs to go see her mama. So mama just got home. So anyways, it's very important to dedicate ourselves enough that we can actually do these things. If we do not dedicate ourselves enough, if we're dedicating ourselves to feeling miserable and thinking about all the bad things or things we don't have or whatever, we're not going to progress, because that's what you're doing. The more practice you get at feeling miserable, the more successful you will be at feeling miserable. The more practice you get at feeling sad, the more successful you will be at feeling sad. The more practice you get at being depressed, the more successful you will be at being depressed. I would say stop practicing it. It's time to start practicing happiness, joy, and things like that. That's much, much more important. I just don't have the time to dwell in self-pity. There's not enough time in a day to be spending time doing that. That's just silliness. So what do we do instead? It's time to work on getting to the Lord. Correct yourself. Wow. Surprised I'm going so long being this excited, but wow, there's a lot of pressure. It's always exciting. Wow. So very interesting. I know I'm kind of being a little bit blunt on a lot of these things. Hopefully it doesn't come across too badly, but it's, sometimes I think you got to say what you got to say. Total devotion and hard work never means, though, to ignore your family or to neglect your duties. It means that you still live the gospel in every aspect of your familial relationships and in every aspect of your duties. You should be living the gospel in every aspect. You should never be going a moment without talking to the Lord. You should always be drawn out in prayer. You should be one thing I got to mention, you need to be very, very careful. And this is of the utmost importance in hearing the voice of the Lord. You have to be very careful in not finding fault with somebody else, including accusing someone of finding fault with you. You have to be ever so careful. As soon as you find fault with someone else, the heavens withdraw. You don't hear the voice of the Lord. Never find fault with anybody, not your husband, not your wife, not your child, not your crazy brother or sister or whoever. Don't find fault, not with your in-laws, not with the neighbors next door. Stop finding fault with people, especially in your mind or in your heart. As soon as you find fault, it blocks things. It blocks it really fast, and it's really hard to get in the right frame of mind to hear again, to hear the voice of God again clearly. You've got to be very careful not to find fault and never accuse somebody of finding fault with you. That if you do, you're not going to hear. It's such extreme importance. It's very, very important. So when you work so hard like this, you're going to get tired, and you're going to get tired a lot. You are going to need to actually keep going, though. Don't stop. Just keep going. Change your mental focus, because the reason you get tired is you're focusing on not achieving your goals. You're focusing on the fact you haven't achieved your goals. You're focusing on that you don't have this, you don't have that. If you change your mental focus, then you start succeeding. And when you start succeeding, you're focusing on trying to do better. Then you start doing better. But never stop. Don't stop. You won't be tired if you're doing well, but don't stop. Can't stop. So as we said, the most important thing is to actually be humble and meek, and to get up and actually live the gospel with everybody with whom you interact, and especially if you're married, especially to your spouse. Don't find fault with your spouse, no matter what. It doesn't matter if you're explaining things or reasoning things or pointing out something or trying to make something better or whatever it is. Don't find fault. If you do, it becomes very difficult to hear the Lord. I mean, you have the right to choose, and you can find it if you want, for whatever reason you want to find it, but it will block the Spirit, and it will block the voice of God. It will block your ears from hearing. So be very, very careful about that. And you have to live the gospel on the inside. If you live it on the inside, you won't break it on the outside. It's pretty easy to tell if somebody's living the gospel on the inside because they don't break it on the outside. If they break it on the outside, you know, they're not living it inside. Because, like the Lord said, everything that comes out of you came from an overflow of what was in your heart. So don't just keep it outside, keep it on the inside as well. And, and to the point where you never make an excuse for anything. Like, never give a reason or justification, you know, anything at all for not doing, keeping the gospel on the inside or anywhere. But it will block your progression. Even the slightest excuse blocks your progression, right? The Lord said, as you seek to cover your sin or to make any excuse, you know, amen to the priesthood of that man. It's done. You gotta, don't make an excuse at all. Don't give a reason. Don't give a justification. Don't give a clarification. Don't make an explanation. No excuses at all. So, what else can a person do to actually get closer to the Lord? How about cutting out some of the things that we put into our minds, like all the television that we put into our minds and all the music and all the books and things that are not good for us? You know, what if you don't like television or music and you like to sit around with your friends and gossip? You know, that's, again, something that is only going to block us. We also have to then limit and get rid of, if we can, of course, all of our habits like that if we want to get to the Lord. Now, realize, of course, that this is not advice or whatever to people who just want to learn the gospel and go to church and be a good little girl or boy and all that fun stuff. You know, this is advice on how to actually talk to the Lord face to face. This is a lot more than just going to church. This is not something you have to worry about if all you're interested in is going to church and living a good little life and that's it. This is advice to answer that question of how to actually talk with the Lord. How to talk with the Lord face to face. First step, of course, is learning to hear his voice. A real, audible, actual voice, physical voice. And so this is advice for that question. So this is not to say everybody has to live this way. This is to say that those who want to talk to the Lord, these are some of the things that help us or block us or whatever, whichever way we're talking about it at the time. So if you actually want to talk to the Lord, you got to stop putting other garbage into your mind. You got to stop, you know, putting gossip in and putting music in and movies in and you know, all the bad stuff that you would put in. You got to be careful not to read smut books and stuff like that. That will block you from hearing so fast. I mean, you're not even going to come close putting that stuff in your mind and in your heart. You got to get rid of that stuff. But again, you know, I have been accused of telling people how to live. I am not telling you how to live. I'm not telling anybody how to live. I am simply answering the question of how to actually get to the Lord, how to hear his voice, how to talk to him face to face, things like that. Prophets get chosen because they put in this work and this amount of work. They devote themselves to this degree, and that's why they get chosen. Now, there are other spirits that will talk to people who do all kinds of nasty things, but that is not the Lord. And that is pretty easy to see, but a lot of people are deceived by those other spirits, you know, and away you go. So this is not to tell anybody how to live. This is not me telling you how to live or anything else. This is just answering the question. In order to reach that level of spiritual growth, that level of spiritual whatever you want to call it, success or something. This is what it takes. This is what it takes to reach that. So again, this is not telling anybody how to live. You can live however you choose to live. That's why everybody has been given agency. But if you want the result of this question, then this is how to attain it. So we do have to be very careful about what we put into our heart and mind, especially, and away we go. So we should be more concerned about interacting with everybody we need to interact with in the day, like we go to work or we're driving along in the car, or we have the day off and we're chatting to our spouse or our children, grandchildren, great grandchildren, or grandma, or in-laws, or the neighbor, or even if we're working in the garden and we're talking to our plants. We need to be helping people and serving people and encouraging people and motivating people. We try hard to lift them up, even though they insult us and say, their own beliefs. We still need to do our part every once in a while to help, not every once in a while, often, every day. So we share in their burdens. And that is the gospel. The Lord doesn't turn them away when they speak to him, and neither should we, obviously. So this is important stuff to do. We have to be this devoted all the time that we're not worried about our own needs. We're not worried about eating and sleeping and resting, and we're only worried about running, helping get things done. There's so much to do. We're worried about getting the help to people we need to help. It says that it's not required for a man to run faster than he has strength. This doesn't mean that the man should sit. It says you're not required to run faster than you have strength. You're still supposed to run as you have strength. So don't mix this up. It says you're supposed to run. You just don't have to run faster than you have strength, but you should be running. This was to alleviate people's anxiety of thinking that they wouldn't make it because they didn't have enough strength to go as fast as the other person. But that is not true. We each have a certain amount of strength. And if we're using our own strength to the maximum amount, then we're doing good. And if you have to sit beside someone you can talk to, help them out. There you go. Keep on going. So again, this is not to tell people how to live. This is only just to answer the question. And this is why we can make it to the Lord. This is why, because we do these things. And, it's just so important to actually live the gospel, to be Zion, that one heart and one mind. But how do you be Zion, one heart and one mind? People often say it's between me and the Lord, but that is not true. The gospel says that you can't be one with the Lord unless you're one with others. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I will be also. Right? And it has to be done the Lord's way, of course. But to be of one heart and one mind, whose mind? Whose heart? Do you think it's just the Lord's heart? It's the other person's heart, not yours. You have to be one. If you hear another person praying for the things that are of their heart, and wouldn't you pray the same prayer and put that same emotion and same desperation into that prayer for them as they have? That's Zion. That's Zion. That's why the Lord will talk to you. That's why, in other words, you will be able to hear him, because your heart is not for yourself. It's for somebody else. And again, be careful of finding fault. Don't find fault and say, that person doesn't pray like that for me. As soon as you do that, you can't hear. So you really need to deliberately drop that type of vanity. Never say what somebody else is thinking or doing or whatever. Don't pay attention to that. You just do what you are supposed to be doing. You know, you have to be deliberately humble in all situations and never think that you know better or that you know what's going on. If you do, then you just blew it. So you need to fight against every threat, like every little speck of pride and rebellion within yourself, every little speck of that pride of saying you know something or thinking you know something or whatever. You got to get that out of you, and you have to get the meekness into you. You know, the meekness where you're going to just take it and keep being good anyways. And that has to be in the heart. It can't just be on the outside where you do it. You have to actually want to inside your heart. You can't do it any other way. If it's not in your heart to actually do it within yourself, you know, if you can't handle being talked to badly, then you're not going to hear the Lord. You know, so you need to really be able to do it within as well, not just on the outside. And the thing is you can't trick the Lord. He knows if you're doing it on the inside. So everybody can actually achieve this level of speaking with the Lord, of course, and where they can hear an audible voice, you know, not just thoughts in their head or carrying on a conversation in their head, but where they're talking to a real live person, you know, with a real voice that everybody can hear, not just you. And I have been in situations, you know, several times where the Lord showed up and it wasn't just me who could see him. And I've been in situations where the Lord spoke and it was not just me who could hear him, where we could hear. And, you know, it's because he's an actual person. So this is important belief to have. You must have perfect trust in this in order to be able to hear. You have to have that complete faith in order to hear. And that complete faith means not only believing correctly, but following correctly. And again, once you get to the Lord, you just have to keep going. You have to keep that momentum going. Don't ever stop. And you know, so when I was a young fella, I actually I would read the books, you know, the scriptures and stuff, and say, how did these, you know, prophets get to the Lord? How did they do this? You know, I would see the miracles in the scriptures and say, how did they do this? There's got to be something I'm missing, because these guys can do it. Why can't I? You know, I knew there was something wrong. I knew there was some doctrine that I didn't understand properly. And I knew there was some doctrine that I did not follow properly. Because if I was following it, I would have those same results as in the scriptures, right? And I couldn't handle it like other people who I would talk to about it would say, well, so and so heard it from so and so, who heard it from so and so, who had a grandmother, you know, that had a neighbor who one time had a miracle. And it goes on like that. And so you get every generation, there's a miracle happens, or somebody says they know somebody who had it, or maybe even they even saw it themselves. That's not good enough for me. That was never good enough for me. I wanted to be on the front line. There's got to be a way. And so this is what prompted me to seek out that way. So I had to let go of all my beliefs. I had to let go of everything that I thought was right, real, and correct. And I had to be an open slate ready to receive correct doctrine. And I had to reach out to a real live God. So, not just one that existed in my head. Wow. I'm lasting good, but this gets hard when I get excited. Voice is getting a little bit hoarse, but hopefully it'll hold up long enough. Anyways, it's so when I was young, I always thought there was something else. There must be a way, that those people talk to the Lord. There must be something that I was missing. So I actually reached out to a God that was real, a God who only had our best interest at heart, never a God who would send us to hell, punish us, or use his magic wand. I had to let go of all of that. I had to let go of that type of belief and actually look for a father, and one who actually was an actual father. And I had to then start learning. And so I laid everything on the altar and I changed every one of my beliefs, and I never again thought that any of my beliefs were correct. And still to this day, I don't hold on to those beliefs, because even the things that I was taught, I think I only understood at a certain um, to a certain level. And every time I get taught again, I understand again. And I've been taught, in person by the Lord many, 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 many times. But every time there's more. Every time the picture gets bigger and brighter and more colorful. And again, don't fall into the trap where you say, well, he just doesn't know this doctrine yet, and I do. As soon as you fall into that trap of thinking that way, you're not going to hear. You won't hear the Lord. You're not Zion anymore. You're not humble. You're not meek. You're again arrogant, and you will not hear. And that happens so often. We have to be so careful never to fall into that trap if you're not humble. There's been so many times where I've tried to share this information with people and they said, oh yeah, we can see that you did that, but we don't do that. And those people still haven't seen the Lord yet. And they don't catch on that it's because of that way of thinking that they will never be able to hear. They'll live their whole life and never be able to hear. You cannot think that way. You cannot feel that you have something that others don't have. You cannot think that you know something that others don't know. As soon as you do, you lose. So don't think that way. And again, this is not telling anybody what to do. It gets annoying that people keep accusing me of this. You ask a question, I give you the answer. It's not telling you what to do, it's the answer of how to do it. So work hard. You have to get off your butt and work. You need to work your spiritual butt right off. You got to make sure you do the heavy, hard work every single day, all day long. Never pass up a chance to do something good. You pray always, at all times, in all situations. You never rest. And you really get rid of that idea of some Mickey Mouse God with his magic wand over you and grant you wishes. Get rid of that. It takes work, and you need to put in the work. And Father will send you all the information you need, but it takes a lot of hard work. And if you disrespect his advice, a word of advice, if you disrespect Father's advice, if he gives you advice and you don't follow it, you argue it, you give an excuse, a reason, an explanation, or anything else, the heavens will close. Do not disrespect his advice. You say, yes, sir, and you follow him if you want those blessings. And if you disrespect his blessings that he gives you, you're not going to be able to hear. You won't hear again. I've seen this happen so many times. Do not disrespect his advice. Do not disrespect his blessings. Do not say you don't disrespect his advice. You're only doing this or that. As soon as you say that, you're done. Don't let that stuff even enter into your heart at all. Like, never. Always be grateful for his blessings. Always say thank you every day, even for a blessing that's years old. Still keep saying thank you every day. Never forget his blessings. Always remember them, and every single one of them. Then otherwise you're going to have to prove yourself again, and that's like pushing that car uphill. You stopped, it's rolling backwards, and you got to get it stopped and start pushing it back up the hill again. It's not easy, and the chances of people fixing that after they've done it become extremely slim. So my advice is never disregard his advice, never disrespect his advice, never give an excuse or a reason. Whether you think it's right or not doesn't matter. Never do it. If you go against any of his advice, then you're not going to hear his voice. That's all there is to it. Of course, there have been some people who went against his advice and then heard his voice again, like Cain. Cain, killed his brother Abel, and Cain got to hear the Lord's voice again. But it was not a happy thing. And myself, I would suggest that that's not something you should look forward to. So what do we do? You have to be very careful. So this is in answer to the question that I get asked, and trying to help people understand to differentiate between that. I'm not telling anybody how to live or what they need to do or any other silly nonsense like that. It's just what the prophets have found that got them to be able to hear the Lord, got them to be able to see the Lord in person. You have to be Zion. You have to be humble. You have to be meek. You cannot look at somebody else and say, well, they're not humble and they're not meek. The moment you do, you fail. Don't do that. You have to be humble. You have to be meek. You have to put in the effort. You have to be devoted. You have to believe in correct doctrine. And you have to follow that correct doctrine every single day, all day long. And keep it going. So this is how, we do it. This is why it works. Again, everyone has their agency and is allowed to make their own choices and their own excuses. But this was to answer a particular question. And I have been, I don't know what the nice word is, it dressed down on social media, where people have come out and started saying all these things. So this is the answer. This is why. And it doesn't bother me that they say these things, except it does bother me that it's going to block their it's going to block their blessings. And that part is sad to me. It doesn't bother me that they think and say bad things about me, but it does bother me that they are blocking themselves from being able to hear the Lord. So it's a pretty sad situation. Anyways, I talked a lot, and hopefully it was coherent. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns? Anybody want to tell me to shut up and go away? Anything else? I'm all ears.
No, I'd just like to hear you say more and stay with us. That's the opposite of shut up and go away.
But it's all the same. All I do is repeat myself.
We're slow. We're
No.
getting it.
It's just a matter of overcoming all those things that we've been taught all our lives.
Yeah.
And yeah, you really got to let go of everything and accept the correct doctrine, and then you have to accept it so much that your beliefs all change, because if you accepted this, then it would seep out. The only logical way is all the other beliefs would have to change. And if they stay the same, you haven't accepted it. So it's kind of, it flows through everything. So, but anyways, I know it's kind of blunt, but this is not something that people should have to worry about thinking, oh, I'm never going to make it to heaven because I can't do this. That's not what this is about. Anybody who keeps the commandments, does good, leads good lives will make it to heaven. You don't have to think I have to accomplish this, 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 in order to make it. What you need to do in order to make it to heaven is keep all the commandments. Don't hurt people. Make sure you keep the commandments. Don't hurt yourself. And make sure that you're helping people, encouraging people. Stop complaining about others and stuff. In other words, don't even hurt them in your own mind or heart. As soon as you're feeling it, a complaint about somebody, then you're hurting them on that level. So all you got to do really to get to heaven is just keep the commandments, be nice. That's it. And you can make it to heaven, no problem. That's easy. You don't have to panic and think you're going to hell for it. But for those who have asked the question, who want to actually talk to the Savior face to face, things like that, it takes a little bit of devotion. It takes a little more effort. And these are the principles that it takes. So,
Yeah.
as if that makes any sense, I hope. Anyways, anybody else? It's already 8:00. I mean, I know for me, I just get it so excited. I wish I could, I mean, my kids know that when I get excited, like when I had the health to be able to speak for long periods of time, which I'm surprised I could go this long. But when I had the health to be able, I'd stand up and pace back and forth, and my arms would be waving, and I'd get so excited, like one of those television preachers, just to go and look like you're swatting flies. So I miss those days.
It's like a scalded ape, as they say.
There you go. There you go. Yep. It's lots of fun. So anyways, that's about all I had. I just wanted to answer that question and clarify a few of those points. And because I know that some people have those types of questions, and they would actually like to know what to do and how to do it. And so I thought we should present the information, at least get it out there. It'll be posted on YouTube, tomorrow, or as soon as it downloads and uploads, all that stuff. And so we can get the information out there. So it's available. So lots of fun. So that's all I had anyways. I just wanted to answer it. So I don't know. What's everybody think? It's all good? Hopefully, maybe. Okay. Do we have a volunteer for a closing prayer?
Yes, we do. I will volunteer.
Excellent. Please go ahead.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank thee for this lesson, and we thank thee for the tools with which we can listen to it. We thank thee for our friends and our family and everyone that we have to learn these things with, and to help us to grow. Please help us to do good and to let go of anything that is holding us back. And in the name of Yeshua Messiah, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Well, and thank you very much.
Well, it's